Hello and welcome to the Alternative Car Show.
Information! We want information!
You ain't gonna get it.
He knows me too well. I make no apology for the prisoner references in this week's episode because we are concentrating on the Lotus 6 and the Lotus 7. Why, I hear you ask, do we mention the Lotus 6? Well, let me enlighten you.
You are number 6.
I am not a number. I am a free man.
Ha 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 ha!
Now, apart from the fact that that particular gag wouldn't have worked without using the Lotus 6, it is still a significant car because it and many of its contemporaries were in fact a stepping stone. Cars in the 1950s and early 1960s, the specials, were based on contemporary chassis. Austin 7s, Ford 10s, basically old pre-war designs that were then rebodied and sometimes they were raced and used as sports cars, but basically these were the options for the post-war generation to get hold of something a little bit exciting. Where the Lotus 6 steps aside from that is it replaced the original chassis with a bespoke space frame chassis. It wasn't alone in this. The Ginetta G2 and Buckland were making similar chassis. That is not unique to the Lotus 6, but where the Lotus 6 is important is where it was to lead to the Lotus 7, but it is still an important car in its own right. Cars like these could be built by a young chap with the earnings that he'd scraped together using components from a dead old car. He could take it racing, drive it to the racing track, race it and drive it home and still be competitive at the bit in the middle. It was an important car for making such things possible. Many racing drivers were to get their first experience in cars like the Lotus 6, and it was to tussle with its rivals well into the early 60s. So let's break it down and look at what makes this Lotus so important to the cars that were to follow. So, where does the Lotus 6 step aside from its contemporaries? Well, first of all, if you look at the likes of the Ginetta G2, they produced a couple of those before they moved on to later designs. So not many were produced. Other people just produced chassis, Buckland being an example, to which you had to buy your own body and then you could build your car. There were several people who did similar things. Other people produced cars in very small numbers and sold them amongst their friends, but they didn't really expand and sell in the numbers that Lotus did with the Lotus 6. But where the Lotus 6 is a bridge between the 1950s specials and the later, more capable 7, is that, like the specials, it used the older running gear that was available at the time, and not the more capable running gear that was introduced in the 7. Another thing was that it had an entirely hand-beaten aluminium body, because that is the way that things were done. It was time consuming, it was beautiful craftsmanship, but it made the car a little bit more expensive than the cars that were to follow. So it was definitely a link between the old and the new. So let's look a little bit closer into the Lotus 6 spec. The introduction and first outings. The prototype Mark 6 appeared and raced in 1952. First outing 5th of July 1952 at Silverstone. Customer kits began delivery in early 1953. The production run. Main production was from 1953 to 1955. Contemporary registries and auction notes show a few late cars appearing in 1956 to 57, basically deliveries and registrations trailing the core run. In total, 110 cars or kits were built and sold. That figure is repeated by multiple independent references and Lotus histories. So, how did Lotus supply it and what did it cost? Well, the Lotus 6 was a kit, not a complete car by default. The Mark 6 was deliberately sold as a kit so buyers avoided Britain's purchase tax on a complete car. Lotus supplied a comprehensive package, chassis, special parts and body. The owner sourced or chose the mechanicals. Period prices, exact list prices varied with spec and buyer supplied parts, so there isn't a single official list price that applies to all cars. Period coverage consistently says a fully completed Mark 6 could be put on the road for about £400, all in with the owner's chosen mechanicals, and that's the best contemporary cost benchmark. Were complete cars sold? Well, Lotus mainly sold in component form, but the factory and dealers did assemble some cars, e.g. the 1950 Works Mark 6 demonstrator, because these were bespoke builds rather than standard catalogue model. There isn't a consistent factory complete car price published for them in period sources. The chassis fabrication was taken on by Progress Chassis Company, and production followed in the same philosophy. Bodywork was produced by the well-renowned Williams and Pritchard, the specialist panel beaters who went on to clothe many early Lotus models. The chassis was a ultra-light multi-tubular steel space frame with stressed aluminium panels riveted and bonded to it. Period weights quoted for the bare frame range from £55 to £63, rising with brackets and panels fitted. Dimensions for a typical Mark 6 wheelbase 2,210mm or 87 inches. Length, width and height was 3,073mm by 1,308mm and 775mm. Track front was 2,045mm and the rear was 1,143mm. Curb weight, depending on engine, was quoted at 432 kilograms or £952. These figures come from period style specs, summarising surviving cars and factory data. The suspension, steering and brakes, as typically supplied, were: front suspension was Lotus conversion of the Ford 10 Prefect or Popular beam to a split swing axle with coilover dampers replacing the donor's leaf springing. Rear suspension was the live rear axle Ford Origin with coilover dampers. Lotus added proper lateral location, a panhard rod, and radius arms, torque control. The steering was worm and nut or peg steering box derived from Ford components. Brakes were typically drum brakes, Ford Girling pattern, cable or hydraulically operated depending on the donor parts and build specification. Wheels, most period cars used the Ford 17-inch pressed steel disc wheels from the Ford Popular. The engine and transmission options, and these are the period correct options offered by Lotus. Lotus designed the Mark VI chassis with multiple engine mounting points, so customers could pick from several inline 4 options. The most common choices were the Ford E93A 1172cc side valve from the Anglia, Prefect and Popular, typically with the Ford 3-speed gearbox. The other options were Ford Console 1.5 litre overhead valve. The early production prototype also ran a short-stroke console engine. The MG XPEG and XPEG 1250 to 1466 to 1500cc as found in the MGTF, and the ultimate was the Coventry Climax FWA in 1100 to 1500cc, the featherweight overhead cam unit for higher budget builds. Why did it matter? Well, the Mark VI's formula, kit supply, featherweight space frame, Ford-based running gear and flexible engine choice produced a car that won far above its weight and critically established Lotus as a production manufacturer. It also set the template that led to the Lotus 7. So here's a quick rundown of the specifications. Launch: prototype raced on July the 5th, 1952, with customer kits from early 1953. Production run: core 1953 to 55, with a handful registered in 1956 and 57. Total number sold: 110. The chassis was a steel space frame with stressed alloy bodywork, and the body was supplied by William and Pritchard in hand-beaten aluminium. Kit pricing and complete cars sold primarily as a kit, but period sources estimate that £400 all in would build the complete car. So there you go. The Lotus 6 was an important contemporary car. It established Lotus as a production manufacturer. It started the ball rolling. It also led to the evolution into the larger and more sophisticated 7, which was to develop further and further to establish Lotus further in the home build, drive to the racetrack and drive home, what we would call today a track day car. Only in those days you actually raced as well. And so to the beginning of the Lotus 7 story. Welcome to another chapter in our journey through automotive history, where innovation meets simplicity. Today we delve into the story of the Lotus 7 Series 1, a car that redefined sports motoring and left an indelible mark on the racing world. Our story begins with the Lotus 6, introduced in 1952 and designed by Colin Chapman. It was a lightweight kit-form sports car that laid the foundation for what was to come, being both enjoyable to drive on the road, cheap to build, but more importantly, very effective on the racetrack. In September 1957, Lotus unveiled the 7 Series 1, a successor that would become an icon. Produced until June 1960, approximately 243 kits were made, with the first 100 assembled at Tottenham Lane, Hornsey, and the remainder at Delamere Road, Cheshunt. The 7's design featured a multi-tubular space frame chassis produced by Progress Chassis Company, utilising 1 inch and 1 3/4 inch tubing. The aluminium-clad body crafted by Williams and Pritchard was often delivered unpainted, showcasing its raw engineering beauty. Up front, the 7 employed independent suspension with transverse wishbones and standard 10 vertical links. At the rear, a live axle was located by twin trailing arms and a diagonal member, ensuring precise handling. Various engine options were offered. The Ford 100E 1172 side valve engine producing up to 40 brake horsepower. There was the Coventry Climax FWA 1100cc engine in the Super 7 delivering 75 brake horsepower, and the BMC A Series 948cc engine available in both home and America models, with outputs ranging from 37 to 43 brake horsepower. Gearbox included 3-speed units for the Ford engines and 4-speed BMC A Series gearboxes with close ratio options available. A Hardy Spicer prop shaft connected to a Nash Metropolitan rear axle. This offered various ratios to suit different driving preferences, especially useful for the racing fraternity. Braking was managed by hydraulic operated 2 leading shoe drum brakes by Girling, with 8-inch cast iron drums at both front and rear. Early models featured Berman worm and nut steering, later transitioning to the Morris 1000 rack and pinion setup. The Super 7 boasted an adjustable column and 3-spoke aluminium leather steering wheel. Standard wheels were 15-inch steel rims with cross-ply tyres. Optional knock-on wire wheels were available, enhancing both aesthetics and performance, again particularly useful for the racing fraternity. The 7's electrical system included a lightweight 12-volt battery, Lucas lighting components, and from January 1960, features like a windscreen wiper motor from the Elite model and electric cooling fan were introduced as well. Instrumentation varied by model, with speedometers, oil pressure gauges, water temperature gauges and ammeters as standard. Tachometers were available at extra cost, especially in the Super 7 and C models. An aluminium fuel tank supplied by Williams and Pritchard was secured using aircraft spec bungee cords. Early cars featured red Vianide trim, later transitioning to red PVC covered dashboards and panels. X-Works prices ranged from £526 for the base model in 1957 to £892 for the Super 7 in 1958. Optional extras included hoods, tonneau covers, spare wheels, wire wheel conversions and more. The 7's compact dimensions, with a wheelbase of 7'4", an overall length of 10'3" and a width of 4'5", contributed to its lightweight nature, with early models weighing as little as £725. The Lotus 7 Series 1 wasn't just a car, it was a philosophy. It was all about lightweight. The emphasis on lightness and simplicity influenced generations of sports cars up to this day and remains a testament to Colin Chapman's visionary engineering. There were other cars of a similar nature produced around the same time, but it is the Lotus 7 that has remained the longest, stayed in production right up to this day, and also influenced more cars than pretty much any other in the kit car world. And so to the Series 2, probably the most successful version of the 7 under Lotus, and a big improvement over the Series 1 in terms of more modern running gear and the introduction of GRP body panels for the nose cone and the wings, for example. But more importantly, it introduced the shape we came to know and love in the 7, and it is the iconic prisoner car. The Lotus 7 Series 2, introduced in June 1960, was a more refined and cost-effective version of the original Lotus 7. It featured a simplified space frame chassis to streamline production and increase efficiency. Another aid to the production process was the introduction of fiberglass body panels to replace the more complicated and costly hand-beaten aluminium nose cone wings. It included a wider range of engine options, including Cosworth-tuned Ford engines. And it would go on to become the longest-running Lotus-built 7 being produced until 1968. Here's a more detailed look at the Series 2. Bodywork. The Series 2 adopted a body shape that more closely resembles the 7 as we know it today. The introduction of GRP greatly enhanced the production process and build process, whilst allowing a little more flair to the styling. It also reduced the chances of damage, but more importantly, it meant Lotus could produce the car in far greater numbers. The aluminium nose cone of the Series 1 was replaced with a fiberglass unit. It now looked more like the Lotus 7 as we would recognise it today on a Caterham. Cycle wings were originally standard, with clamshell units available as an option. Again, being GRP made replacing damaged wings cheaper and easier. Chassis. It featured a simpler chassis compared with the Series 1. While still a multi-tubular space frame, the Series 2 design would be easier to produce. Engines. While the 1172 side valve unit remained available until 1962, the Series 2 typically used Ford Kent engines of 1340 or 1499 cc. Some with Cosworth modifications. The Kent engines were more tunable, and Lotus, in collaboration with Cosworth, were very familiar with this unit thanks to work done with Ford to create the Lotus Cortina. Bringing it to the lightweight 7 made perfect sense, and the performance options for customers made the 7 legendary. If there was one flaw with the Series 2 design, it was the continued use of the standard companion estate rear axle and differential. Sourced from the standard companion estate car, it proved inadequate for the power and cornering forces of the Kent-powered 7. This was a problem that would eventually be addressed in the Series 3 with the adoption of the Ford Cortina rear end. Production run. The Series 2 was produced from June 1960 to August 1968, making it the longest production run under the stewardship of Lotus Cars. Approximately 1,310 examples were built, with cars sold both domestically as well as being shipped to overseas markets. TV career. It would also reach iconic status, being driven by Patrick McGoohan in the cult TV series The Prisoner. Though it was only to appear in a couple of episodes, being the centrepiece of the opening credits put the Seven front and centre. Even today, the Seven will forever be a legend as generation after generation rediscover the spy series. Do you have any special memories of the Series 2 Lotus 7? Was it your favourite model? Please feel free to share your memories in the comments below. The Series 3 shone brightly for a very short time under Lotus, and yet it was to emerge later on, which we will come back to. But first, let's tell the story of the Series 3, which answered one of the major problems with the Series 2, which was the weak rear axle of that particular model. The Lotus 7 Series 3 can be regarded, if you just go on sheer numbers, as one of the least successful of the Lotus 7s under Lotus. However, it went on to become more significant once it had been taken over by Caterham, and they reverted from the Series 4 to the Series 3 shape. Another aspect which will have affected the sales was the fact that the Series 4 was only in production for 4 years. Launched in 1968 as an evolution of the Series 2, it fixed the main problem with the Series 2, which was the weak rear axle, and standardised Ford running gear, so Escort, Cortina-sourced live axles and 4-speed gearbox. Typical engines were the reliable 1.6 Ford Kent Crossflow. There was also a very rare twin-cam SS version, which appeared in 1969, but only 13 were built. Lotus ended production soon after introducing the Series 4 in 1972. So how did the Series 3 differ from the Series 2? Well, the Series 2 usually came with a 1.3 or 1.5 Ford pre-Crossflow engine with the option of Cosworth tuned options. There were 3 or 4-speed gearboxes depending on spec, and the rear axle from the standard companion, which is the weak point of the design. The Series 3 typically used a 1.6 litre Ford Kent Crossflow and 4-speed Ford gearbox. It also had the sturdier Ford Cortina type rear axle. The twin cam SS used a Lotus twin cam tuned to 115 to 125 brake horsepower. The dimensions offer small variation across the years and the specifications. The Series 2 was 132 inches in length, 55 inches in width, with a 88-inch track. Typical weight, 445 to 1,000 pounds depending on the trim levels, whereas the Series 3 was slightly longer at 144.5 inches. The width was again slightly wider at 60.3 inches, and the wheelbase was 88 inches. Typical weight was quoted at 549 kilograms. In short, it was a little longer, a little wider, and a little heavier than the Series 2. Lotus' own model history lists a volume of 340 for the Series 3, produced between 1968 and 1972. This aligns with the Series 3 being the shortest lived 7 shape from Lotus before the S4 arrived. Within that total, about 13 with the twin-cam SS models. Of course, once Caterham took over the licensing and production of the Lotus 7, they decided that the Series 3 shape was more appealing than the Series 4 that replaced it, and thus the evolution of the Caterham began with the Series 3 shape. So overall, you could argue that the Series 3 was in fact the most successful of the Lotus 7s. But it cannot be denied what an influence this car has had on the wider specialist car industry. What are your thoughts? Do you have any special memories of the Series 3 Lotus 7? Have you owned one? Have you had a ride in one? Please leave your comments below. Last but not least under Lotus was the Series 4. Some people regard this as the least popular of the 7s, but it sold well and it was definitely a child of its time. Personally, although I do prefer the Series 3, the Series 4 does have a certain charm at the front, if not so much at the rear. It introduced more GRP bodywork and, well, let's tell the story. And here we are at the end of the Lotus 7 with Lotus, the final factory Lotus Badge 7, the Series 4. Introduced in 1970 with a new GRP body over a simplified space frame chassis. It was aimed at lowering build cost and broadening appeal, with more cabin space, heater, demist, and a few other little luxuries. Models in the range included the Lotus 7 S4 1300 with the Ford Kent 1298cc Crossflow, the S4 1600 with the Kent 1599cc Crossflow, and the Lotus S4 Twin Cam with the Lotus Ford 1558cc Twin Cam, which was mirrored by the unit used in the Elan. These were pretty well a continuation of the models available on the line under the Series 3 lineup, but dressed up in the new Series 4 chassis and body. So what were the key changes between the Series 3 and the Series 4? Well, body and packaging. The alloy panel bodywork of the Series 3 was replaced by an entirely GRP shell with wider, longer proportions, more luggage and cabin room, and weather gear as standard, as well as luxuries like a heater and screen demister. The chassis was a simplified frame with fewer tubes, flat sections to reduce build time and cost, whilst retaining double wishbone front suspension and the live rear axle layout. From a usability and safety point of view, it gained a collapsible steering column, generally more civilized trim and specification. And as mentioned earlier, the powertrains were the same engine family as the Series 3, with the Ford Kent 1300 and 1600 and twin cam. So the performance step up was mainly from weight and aerodynamic changes rather than anything to do with engines. So let's look a little bit more in depth. The Lotus type number was the Lotus Type 60. The dimensions were 143.6 inches, which is 372 centimetres wide, 60.5 inches or 154 centimetres in height, and 41.5 or 44 inches screen hood. Wheelbase was 90 inches or 228.5 centimetres. The front track was 48.4 inches and the rear track was 49 inches. Typical weight was 690 kilograms, quoted for the top spec with Lotus Heritage on the Lotus Heritage table. Curb weights varied by engines and trim specs. The top rated engine, as mentioned before, was the twin cam, and that was quoted as having around 125 brake horsepower. Transmissions were 4-speed Ford gearboxes, which were all period items. Ford 3-rail units were common across the Series 3 and Series 4. Steering was rack and pinion with 2 3/4 turns lock to lock with the collapsible column. Suspension, front was double wishbone coil spring and the rear was live axle with locating links coil springs. Brakes, front discs, rear drums. Wheels and tyres, 13-inch steel alloy or alloy options, which were period fitments, varied by spec and market. But 13-inch wheels were standard across the Series 3 and the Series 4. So the final factory Lotus 7 or the factory Lotus Badge 7, introduced for 1970 with the new GRP bodywork over a simplified space frame, was basically the forte of the Series 4. Key changes over the Series 3 were the body and packaging. The bodywork was, let's just say, somewhat divisive, but it was definitely of its time, and to my mind at the front it doesn't look bad at all. It was at the rear where it kind of droops away a little bit. Now the sales of the 7 Series 4 were built and administered by Lotus Components rather than the main factory. This is a subsidiary tasked with customer competition cars, and the 7 in the late 60s, managed by Mike Warner. This was focused on making the 7 viable, and as it was a kit, it was deemed that the parts department were the best to deal with it. Retail sales in the UK were channeled through the Lotus dealer network, with Caterham car sales with Graham Nern, the principal, the last remaining UK agent, and later they bought the rights to the 7 in 1973. Numbers produced, there's mild variance depending on the sources you go to, but the following are the most commonly cited with sources known. So the numbers we get from various sources are that 625 to 664 Lotus 7 Series 4 were built by Lotus. Lotus Heritage page quotes 625. Haggerty UK cites 664, built before Caterham took over. Caterham briefly carried on assembling Series 4 post the rights deal before switching back to the Series 3, and they produced a further 38. Steel Brothers in New Zealand, under license, built 95 kits assembled, continuing Series 4 till March 1979. These carry Lotus chassis tags and broadly match the UK spec with some local options. A realistic budget for Series 4 assembly is that 760 to 800, counting the 625 to 664 by Lotus, 38 by Caterham, and Steel Brothers adding a further 95. So that gives us a total of the 760 to 800 total production run for the Series 4. So you could argue that the Series 4 didn't end in 1973 when Caterham took over the 7. It was actually produced until 1979 in New Zealand. But it definitely was a turning point for Lotus as the company moved up market and moved the 7 to the parts department. It seemed to be overshadowed more and more by other models in the range. And this was where Caterham stepped in and gradually took on more and more of the marketing of the car, and eventually it was logical for them to take over production of the Series 4. But it was definitely a model of its time. It sold in reasonable numbers, and as with all Lotus 7s, you can't just dismiss the Series 4 because it wasn't as beautiful as the others. It was still a Lotus 7, and therefore the performance, the handling certainly lived up to the reputation built over the previous generations. So how do we define the Series 4 with regards to the other models that were produced up until then? Well, it was the last of the kit-built 7s under Lotus. It was also the last of the 7s under Lotus. It was arguably the most modern of the Lotus 7s, and it was sold in reasonable numbers overall, so you can't really call it a failure. And of course, the Lotus 7 Series 4 wasn't the end of the story. It was only the end of the story for Lotus. Hope you've enjoyed this little look back at the early Lotus, and if you have, please click on the thumbs up. That tells people like us that there's something here that they'll enjoy. Also, click on the bell. Click on the all option on the drop down, and then you'll be informed when more of our videos go live. By the Series 4, Caterham pretty well had taken over the marketing of the 7 for Lotus, so it was a logical step for them to take over. So here is Steve Hull with the Caterham story.
For another episode of our Total Kit Car History File series in association with Enwins Motors. Interesting one this time. We're going to be talking about Caterham cars. Now, not Caterham 7. Most people, I guess inevitably in 30 years time we might do a video on the Caterham 7. Not that a great car though it is, but we all kind of know what a Caterham 7 is. And if I did a roundup of all the Caterham 7 models that have been produced in the last God knows how many years, since 1973, I think this one might be a 58 parter and it might last 2 hours each video. So we're not going to do that. We're going to look at what I think is quite an interesting subject though. We're going to look at the history of Caterham cars, which is worthy of a quick video in its own right. This isn't a light video, it's going to be a standard one, length one. Quick bit of background. Obviously the the Lotus 7, the name implies it was created by Lotus Cars. Caterham Cars became concessionaires for that, and at times were sole concessionaires. They also had the concession to sell new cars taken away from them a couple of times as well, at least once, I think, maybe twice. And which time they concentrated on servicing and repairs and accident damage stuff. At various times they also sold Lotus At, but I think primarily they concentrated on the 7. When Colin Chapman decided that enough was enough with the 7 and he wanted to become a, inverted commas, proper car manufacturer, Caterham Cars' Graham Nern was in exactly the right place. In fact, he'd been working on trying to buy the model because he'd got wind that Colin Chapman was blowing hot and cold on it, and he'd changed his mind and all the rest of it. But he was in pole position when and worked closely with Graham Arnold, who was then a director at Lotus, marketing and sales and such like. But let's wind it all the way back. 1959, when Purley, as in Surrey, just to the south of Croydon, rugby club members, Graham Nern, Ian Smith, Nick Carter and Alex Bromley, over a couple of beers no doubt, decided they'd like to start a company that was involved with cars. And they would like to call it Caterham Car Sales and Coachworks. Nern we know about. Nick Carter and Alex Bromley we don't know very much about at all, and indeed they departed the scene fairly quickly. But let's look at Ian Smith. Now he's a very interesting character, a good friend of Colin Chapman, an author, and later on probably the man that founded what became Autosport, really, the Autosport show, when it was called the Racing Car Show, when he was a committee member of the BRSCC. And later I think he was chairman of that. He's a very interesting character, Ian Smith, and a very good writer. I'm not sure what his exact day job was, but I think it was involved with media and writing. But they got themselves a little workshop up on Caterham on the Hill. Now, if you don't know the Surrey area, and so East Surrey area, there's actually two Caterhams. There's Caterham on the Hill and Caterham Valley. Two distinct. They're not towns really. I suppose as a whole they are. I guess it's a bit like Dallas, Fort Worth, or Budapest. They're actually two towns forming one. Although I think both of those have got rivers going through them. There's no river separating Caterham on the Hill and Caterham Valley, apart from a very big steep hill. Anyway, that workshop was once occupied by Sir Malcolm Campbell, no less, and then later on Tony Crook, who became the owner of Bristol Cars, but at that time was a racing driver, bought and sold racing cars, and indeed was an Arbath. I think he might have been the first Arbath. I know he was the first Arbath dealer before Radbourne Racing got involved and really put Arbath on the map in the UK. But anyway, Graham Bradshaw Nern was born in Catford in South London, September the 20th, 1933. His family had moved to the leafy Purley area because he went to Purley Grammar School, did his national service in the army, but then he got involved with the family's timber business. As I said, there was a gang of four who founded Caterham, what we know as Caterham Cars these days, Caterham Car Sales and Coachworks. Now, again, Ian Smith comes into it. He wrote the book, The Lotus, the first 10 years. Now, as I said, he was a good friend of Colin Chapman's, and he got wind that Colin Chapman was looking for agents, or dealers as we call them these days, for Lotus, and he put forward the idea that the fledgling little company in Caterham could be a dealer. And indeed, he got that deal, and they were appointed agents for the 7 and the Lotus At, and it grew quite quickly. As I mentioned earlier as well, Bromley and Holmes left fairly quickly. Later followed by the ambitious Smith, who had other fish to fry, obviously. and so left Nern in sole control of the business. In addition, I think again people say that all the eggs were in the Lotus basket. They weren't. They bought and sold other sports cars at that time, particularly Austin Healey Sprites and Midgets. And they also, at various times, were agents for other specialist marques, such as Gilban, Marcos and TVR, and also agents for Pico exhaust as well. Graham also, and again, a lot of people don't know this or just don't know this. So Graham had a car sales showroom in the leafy and well-heeled Fortis Green part of North London, which is interesting as well. And it was that building. In that building, it was where ex-Lotus mechanic and Hillman engine expert Willie Griffiths was based, and it was later taken over by Roger Nathan. And in later years, these things all have a habit of intertwining into each other. It was a branch of Paul Michael's Hexagon Motors car sales outlet. So, young Nern, enthusiastic Nern, company going places. He ran a series of inside front cover adverts in Motorsport magazine every month, and that was a perfect avenue for pre-internet Britain. Motorsport standing at that time was considerable. Good publication though, it still is, and it was easy for Nern to reach his target audience. The first hiccup he had with Lotus was in '62, when Lotus cut their dealer network and started selling cars direct from the factory, which was a logical thing for them to do, but the hand that fed cut off the food, and it a lot of problems for companies like Caterham. However, Graham was undeterred because he got himself a good footing, a good base point to work from, and he had a great reputation, and that's where he switched to buying and selling second-hand sevens and Elans, because people forget that as well. And he continued to maintain service and restore them. In many ways, other than a brand new brand new Lotus 7 being ordered, it was business as usual. Excuse me. Even if an owner, and it was good, such was his standing, that even if an owner hadn't bought that 7 from Caterham car sales, there was a good chance they'd go there for their spare parts. It became very quickly the place to go for anything Lotus 7. And indeed, the subheading for the company was the 7 Centre, which does appear on some of their early adverts, actually. So that's another interesting little pointer. The coachworks as well was an interesting part. They had a coachworks. They had crash repair business for production cars. I mean that at various times of hardship, the coachworks business would often bail out the car sales business. Such was the sort of cutthroat nature and the delicacy, if you will, of the economy at that time. Always wanted to see an opening. Graham always was very sharp in terms of looking for angles, and he spoke to Colin Chapman face to face at the racing car show in January '66, and he inquired then because he felt that he'd be really well placed to take over the 7, and he inquired about the future plans for the model, and it was clear that even then Chapman had begun to fall out of love with the little car, and he told Nern that he wasn't sure what he was going to do with it, but he would keep him in mind if he decided to get rid of it. And this was just after the company had moved from Cheshunt to their current base in Hethel in Norfolk, so quite a few things were up in the air then. Anyway, undeterred and didn't take no for an answer, Graham sought out the then new Lotus Components boss, because Lotus Components were the ones that sold the kits. And boss at that time, David Lazenby, to try and find out what was really going on. And he was told that since the move, Lotus had actually recommenced production of the 7, and they were extremely but they were extremely busy building all the Team Lotus cars. That's the other thing, that again, Lotus was divided into several little chunks. Lotus Components, as I say, handled the kits, and Lotus 7 and all the racing cars other than Formula One they built. So every time they were busy building racing cars, the 7 got squeezed, really, I suppose. And they, at that time, they were selling quite a few of the Lotus Type 51, which is a Formula Ford car that had appeared first in 1967. So I think whenever they got busy on racing cars and such like, they downed tools on the 7 and just put it to the side, which is why sometimes supply could be quite hit and miss, really, I think. And Graham was also tipped off by Lazenby that Lotus had sufficient components in stock at Hethel to just about be able to build 20 complete 7s, which the Series 2 as it was then. When Lazenby told him that if he could sell that surplus stock, Lotus would continue to produce the car. So what did Graham do? What would you have done if you were Graham and you were kind of not reliant, not dependent, but you were very interested and passionate about the 7? He bought the lot, which was good. Acted as a double edge, really, because it reassured Colin Chapman that there was a demand for the car, even though Graham had bought them all himself. And it kind of reinvigorated him, and so he became interested in the 7 for a time again. So it backfired on Graham, because I think his plan was to buy it there and then, but it just spurred Chapman on. But I don't think Graham really bothered too much, because he just wanted the 7 to continue in production. I remember Graham. I knew Graham quite well, and I always loved talking to him. And he always told me he didn't like surprises. And he knew that deal, even though he'd done that deal, he knew that there could be a few surprises lurking within that. And he took a hands-on approach on this one, and he personally travelled to Norfolk to look at to go through the inventory and to see exactly what was there, and to make sure that actually what Lazenby had told him, and there were enough parts to make 20 complete 7s, was actually true. And he just wanted to make sure all the parts were there. Interestingly, about the car sales and the coachworks, Graham had some magnetic banners, advertising, we call it letter write, but he had them on magnetic boards. So when he was on, or when that Works Land Rover, I think, was on Caterham Coachworks business, they were double-sided, by the way. So it would have, very often, so it was on Coachworks business. When it was on Caterham Cars business, he'd turn them around and stick them on, put that side of the bit to advertise that if he was towing a 7 or something. I also think that sometimes he had one on one side of the car and another on the other side. It was all quite mix and match, really. Really quite clever. Another boost for the little 7 came with the 7's appearance in The Prisoner TV series, starring the actor, the well-known actor Patrick McGoohan. The deal for this, there was 2 actually, I think, supplied, even though one, it just aided continuity. Lotus, it was all said Lotus supplied the cars. I think Caterham supplied at least one of them. And Graham himself took the car there and was used as an extra, making an on-screen appearance, I think, as McGoohan's driver. And indeed, that appearance, that was the start of a long friendship with Patrick McGoohan. Lifelong friendship. 1968, David Lazenby left Lotus Components to set up Hawk Racing Cars. That's Hawk with an E. And Mike Warner took his place. And he had to get up to speed with things that were going on, and also to get an idea on exactly how the relationship with Graham Nern worked. Warner and Nern did get on well. But certain things I think he found were surprising for Graham. And I think he was surprised to learn that they lost money on everyone sold. It was seen as just a way, I think, sometimes by Lotus to just generate some hard cash, really. Warner was, I think, quite a diligent guy. It became apparent in the early 70s that development costs were far higher than they expected, which actually cost Warner his job, I believe. But it did give Graham another of the opportunities he liked, and so he decided to press Colin Chapman once more to see if he could take over the whole 7 project. This time, it didn't fall on deaf ears. He'd been visited by another Lotus part of the management team, John Berry, who Chapman had sent down to Caterham with the intention of selling Graham a batch of Lotus 51 Formula Fords that were in storage in a barn in Hethel. Graham being Graham, he spotted a chance and used the 51s as a bit of a lever. And he took a punt, and he reckoned that he had a great chance to shift those Formula Fords, which he did. Didn't take him long either. But he agreed to take them if he could take over the 7 project, lock, stock and barrel. And after long consideration of that offer, Chapman agreed, and agreed that it would make sense to do so, because that batch of 51s was hard cash. And he tasked his finance director, Fred Bushell, to actually thrash out a deal with Graham. As I said, it was good for Lotus, as it would bring them much needed cash, while for Caterham Cars and Sales and Coachworks it was a logical step. Big one though. And as Graham said in subsequent years, it was a big step, bigger than he actually anticipated, to be changed from an agent to a manufacturer. And I don't think that helped. Someone at Lotus had lost all the all the parts numbers and records on file, and all the records pertaining to the 7, I think, which made it very, very difficult for Caterham to, well, I think initially to even be able to build their own car. There was certainly a lot of trucks turning up at moving from Hethel to Caterham over a period of a couple of weeks, and I think what Lotus had told them was that they had certain parts, and when it turned out they didn't have certain parts, but they had stocks of other parts that Caterham were unknowing about, and it was just generally difficult. And of course, it should be said that Lotus had a network of engineering companies almost on tap. Whatever they couldn't do in house, they had close by, at close hands, at close quarters, should I say, an engineering company that could produce the parts quickly and cheaply, that whatever they needed. As Caterham found out, they didn't need the big quantities that Lotus did, so therefore if they asked for a batch of 10, 50, even 100 of a certain component, when an engineering company would be looking for 1,000 or 2,000 minimum, Caterham Cars were faced with incredibly high prices, or the companies just weren't interested in dealing in small numbers. So they had to get around that, which again put a strain on things at Caterham. As it was, there was real sort of space was at a real premium at Caterham on the Hill. I don't know if you've ever seen pictures of it. There was a little petrol station out front, and there was a collection of, I suppose we could call them sheds, which served as workshop, showroom, parts store. The Coachworks had their own shed, and space was at a premium to store the stuff that they really needed. It was, as I said, it was a big difference between fixing, servicing and selling 7s to actually making them. They did extend what was called the Town End site up on the hill. Much of the footprint did remain the same, but Graham rented an old boatyard site close to his base, and also managed to rent as many lock-up garages as he could find in Caterham. But the financial strain was considerable. And 1973, of course, wasn't a good year for the economy. What with 3-day weeks, strikes, power cuts, and the sports car market was particularly badly hit as a result of what was seen as a luxury. We weren't going to talk about the car itself, but we should really. Graham took over the the S3, Series 3 version of the 7. Of course he took over the 7, you idiot, Steve. But quickly, David Wakefield was a nice guy and a really very important name in the history of Caterham cars. Became a co-director, pretty nice chap. Initially, he was in charge of Coachworks. That was his side, but he became increasingly more involved with the car sales business. And indeed, the Coachworks was squeezed out after a few years. So it was his idea to revisit the Series 3. So he came up with another plan to... he ran a couple of adverts, I seem to remember, that was something along the lines of we've got enough parts to build. Did the Caterham, a Lotus trick really. Said they had a special edition they were going to make. They had enough to make, I think, 20 cars of the old Series 3 model. First come, first served. Job's a good one. Anyway, they were knocked out, literally overwhelmed with response to that. And it didn't take long before they decided to revert to the Series 3. And pretty much the Caterham 7 that we know and love today. But that's talking about the cars. So there we go. But anyway, value-added tax came in April, on April the 1st, 1973, and definitely wasn't a joke. That hit the kit car market particularly very hard, as it replaced purchase tax, which had been running since October 1940. And VAT, as it soon became known, was set at just 10%, applied at the point of manufacture, whereas there were different rates of purchase tax that were applied on the wholesale price, and they varied between 13, 22, 36 and 55%, depending on how, for want of a better word, luxurious the item was. But the introduction of VAT was enough, however, for the likes of Gilban, TVR and indeed Lotus to cease offering their products in kit form, as there was no benefit. And add to this the fact that Triumph, MG, Jensen had stopped making sports cars in 73, and you can see it was a tricky marketplace in the UK. However, I think we should all admire Graham's bravery. He stuck at it. Helped greatly by David Wakefield. 7 House is what the main building at Townend was called, and it might well have sounded more substantial than it actually was. The building itself was no more than a converted 2-up, 2-down Edwardian house that was, being honest, always in need of a lick of paint and a general spruce up. The showroom was upstairs, interestingly, with the workshop and parts department out back. Graham's office was upstairs, as was accounts, and such was the constraints of space that when Arch Motor delivered the chassis, they had to be lined up against a rickety old fence at the mercy of the elements, really, until they were needed for production. That continued right through to the opening of the Dartford factory in 1987. Official handover of the 7 from Lotus to Caterham took place at the marvellously marvellous pub Lotus, which was an old Bass Charrington pub, formerly known as the Chalk Farm Tavern, that Graham Arnold decided that would be a great place, a great idea to have a Lotus themed pub. And there was all manner of stuff on the walls, steering wheels, all sorts of things. We may well do a little video on Pub Lotus, indeed, in a future episode. Maybe do a history file light on that. December the 15th was the day that pub opened in 1970. And Wheelbase, which was sort of a forerunner of Top Gear, did a live broadcast from it, which was amazing, on BBC One. Situated, for reference, at the corner of Regent's Park Road in Primrose Hill. Oh, actually, I think it's really Chalk Farm, but much like Caterham say their factories in Dartford, I think technically it's Crayford, but Dartford sounds a bit posher, in Mrs. Bouquet's terms, than Crayford, so it followed that. So I think it follows with Primrose Hill. Excuse me. The site itself, anyway, yeah, we shouldn't really talk about Pub Lotus here, really. We'll come back to that. But I remember talking to Graham about the handover, and he was quite downbeat about it. He said that in his opinion, most of the press that were invited were there just to enjoy the beer and the Skittles and the sandwiches, and just denoted by the fact that as soon as the official speeches were done, they all tore off without really taking the opportunity to interview Graham or indeed Colin Chapman. And I always found that quite sort of poignant, really. Caterham itself, Caterham Cars, they moved to an old Vauxhall dealership. They switched from one Caterham to the other. They went down to the valley, almost next door to Caterham Valley Railway Station, the end of the line, as it were, there. And they stayed there for many years. They grew sufficiently to open as the factory in Crayford, controversial, Dartford, 1987, where the cars were built. So it took away the strain that they quickly outgrew the Vauxhall dealership. So the Vauxhall dealership, actually, there's a second-hand new showroom, second-hand car sales and servicing. And all the building work was, car building work was done at Dartford. I'm going to resist saying Crayford because it just winds people at Caterham up if you say that, and I don't mean to do that because they're really good folk and I get on well with them, so I don't want to wind them up. Anyway, so that's sort of the early history of Caterham Cars. Nern family sold out to, I think it was a venture capitalist called Corven in 2007, was it? I think, from memory, when Ansar Ali took over. Before that, Simon Nern had sort of taken over from his father Graham when he retired and ran the company for several years. Ansar took over. And it was pretty much the same. Ansar made a few changes. He went away from one man, one car on the production side of things, and he introduced shall we say, a proper production line. He oversaw the launch of the CSR range. He saw a period of great growth actually for Caterham. And then when Tony Fernandez, and his business partner acquired the brand, they were running AirAsia, they were running Queen's Park Rangers Football Club, and they were heavily involved or got involved in Formula One. And at that time, Caterham suddenly had an F1 team. They had other bases, I think one in Norfolk, one at Leafield. They had Mike Gascoigne on board as part of the Formula One team. He's a very well-known engineer in Formula One. And I think they had a GP2 motorcycle race team. They had Caterham bikes. They had Caterham composites. It suddenly grew to a very big operation. Interestingly, I don't think I always thought that the sort of association with F1 and the massive, huge viewing figures that Formula One gets on TV would see Caterham sales go from 600 to 60,000, but it didn't materialise, and sales didn't really change that much. Obviously, it helped the brand, and it is a great brand, and what a fantastic car. But they also moved away from Caterham, which that caused a lot of controversy with a lot of purists who really hated the idea. The town of Caterham didn't much like it either, but as Caterham Cars pointed out, the lease on the building had run out. So they first moved down to Crawley, which is over the border into West Sussex, about 17 miles away, I think. Initially, I think as a stopgap, they moved into what I think it was people say it was an old plum-based shop. I don't think it was that, but it was certainly on a pretty nondescript industrial estate for a time while they took stock. And then they moved to a very nice facility, a large facility over on the industrial estate, which is actually right sort of parallel with the runway at Gatwick. So even though it's classed as Crawley, it was the Gatwick runway that they were very close to. Stayed there for several years, and in fact that building only closed in September 2023. They obviously new sales there, a huge stock of second-hand Caterham 7s and other models that have come along, like the 21 and such like. You'd find them there. And they also did a lot of servicing work there. And indeed, when sales for export models became very buoyant, sort of 21, 22, they used part of the Caterham Crawley facility as an overflow satellite build centre. So they were building cars there as well. And what was really cool about that was, I can't remember which way round it was. If they were building UK, I think they were building UK cars, and Dartford, don't mention Crayford, was doing the export stuff. And the beautiful thing about, and I really liked it at the Crawley build site, was that they put up viewing areas so that they couldn't do that. They couldn't do that at Dartford because it was a fully industrial factory. But you could sit and have a cup of coffee and watch a couple of guys building your Caterham 7 with your name on it on the trolley. And I thought that was fantastic, and people loved that. Around about sort of reason it closed in 2023, Caterham changed the way they operated. You can't actually, I don't think, buy a 7 from Caterham directly anymore. They'd appointed a set of strategically placed agents around the country, including marvellous chopper builders, Crazy Horse, and they are responsible for the new car sales. Caterham have now moved into, it's on the same street, I believe. Haven't been there at the time of recording this in June 2024. Haven't been there. They've doubled the size of that factory to a magnificent, and the photograph accompanying this video, and it can only be, the only word I can use is magnificent new factory in Dartford, Crayford. 20,000 square foot, I think, on 2 floors. And it's just come on stream at the end of May 2024. Looking forward to going there. And that kind of brings us up to date. Oh, sorry, I forgot the change of ownership. Change of ownership came along in about 2019, I think, 2019. I honestly, I can't find the piece of the notes there applying to that piece, so you have to forgive me. Relatively recently, their hitherto Japanese importer bought the company. So they are now manufacturers, much like Graham Nern was, I suppose, when he was agent for Lotus. The importer or the agent has bought the company, and they've got big plans indeed. That the amalgamation of the 2 factories was one, and the change of the way they trade. But judging by the photograph we've put up here, you can see, crikey, business must be good at Caterham, because you can see all manner of cars under build, and I think that's incredibly reassuring. As someone that's passionate about the specialist car industry, ever since I was involved, the first specialist car I ever drove was a Caterham twin cam Super Sports. It's close to my heart, and I'm very passionate about the marque, and I find that factory, the site of that, I haven't been there yet, but the photograph of that new factory I find incredibly reassuring, and all that sort of stuff. Without further ado, let me take care of a bit of business first of all. If you haven't already subscribed, please could you do so. Still about 30% of people that watch these videos, and you're welcome, obviously, don't subscribe. Doesn't cost you a penny, and it really does help the channel, and it will help us moving forward. I can assure you of that. And if you could also hit that like button, that'd be fantastic too. Anyway, subject to this one is an interesting one. It's almost like the target area that we've got. I could literally put a blindfold on and pin the tail in the donkey, and I'll come up with a winner every time, really. So this time we're looking at the Caterham 21. Underrated car. Struggled a little bit during its gestation period, which took a little bit too long, in my humble opinion. But it was a really good car, and it deserved to sell more than the 49-ish. I think it sold than that, really. Anyway, back to the early part of the 90s, and rumours rumours abounded that Caterham was actually working on a second model to join the 7. And following the adage, actually, that I can't assume that everybody knows what I'm talking about. If you're a regular around here, fantastic, and thank you for continuing to support us. Excuse me, but if you're not, then you're probably going to wonder what the heck I'm talking about. And especially if you were looking for a video to help size your wall in advance of some wallpaper. Anyway, Caterham cars are the kings of the 7. The Caterham 7. They've been making that car since 1973. It's dominated their history, really, obviously, because before that they weren't always sole concessionaires, because Lotus changed their minds a little bit, but they always were working on the car almost since it was launched in 1957. Caterham Car Sales and Coachworks was founded in 1959, so they were also, I believe, if not the first, one of the very first Lotus service centres. Lotus Centres, I think they call them, and they were officially appointed to sell the 7. And if I'm not mistaken, excuse me, the Elan as well. And the Caterham the Lotus Centres that Chapman appointed, I think we're expected to sell Elans too. At least initially, anyway. I'm recording this in February, and I'm just getting over February 2025. That is, and I'm lucky, touch wood, this year I didn't get hit with a horrible chest infection that I did last year, which made me sound like Darth Vader. I've had a little one and a little head cold, but I've put some Vicks on my chest, got my teddy bear out, and Carol's tucked me up in bed just to make sure that I'm all warm and can get better nicely. No, seriously. I've got a tickly cough, so I do apologise. I've got my water, which I forgot last time. But if I have to, if I do cough, I'm trying not to. But I warn you now, I might be. So where is Caterham? Caterham is situated in Surrey. There are actually 2 parts of Surrey. Excuse me. There's Caterham on the Hill and Caterham Valley. At various times, Caterham cars populated both. Initially they were based in a lovely old motley crew of units up on a place called Townend, which was just centre of Caterham on the Hill, formerly occupied by one Anthony, best known as Tony Crook, later of Bristol Cars. He moved out, and they pretty much moved in straight away after him. He was a Fraser Nash racer, very good racer, and he serviced and sold and raced a various collection of cars, including a Bristol. That was prior to him taking over the company, and a very handy peddler. But anyway, and I think he was racing a few Fiats, I think, as well, because he certainly became, before Radbourne Racing had the Arbath agency, he certainly was importing Arbaths to the UK. I found a couple of brochures actually the other day. I thought they were Radbourne ones, which are pretty rare in their own right, but they were actually Tony Crook ones, which is good. But he wasn't doing the Arbaths from there, I don't think. He moved off to another part of Surrey before obviously taking over Bristol and setting up in Kensington. So Caterham, and there's Caterham Valley. Caterham then, when they sold up, when they got the factory at Dartford, they retained Townend for a little while before a Vauxhall garage or Vauxhall dealer in Caterham Valley, down the hill in the valley, Layham's I think they were called, vacated that building, and Graham could see the benefit of setting up the showroom, a purpose-built showroom indeed, right next to the train station in Caterham Valley. So that's kind of where we are with that. So Caterham refers to the town, or 2 parts to the town. I think it's a bit like Dallas Fort Worth, but on a smaller scale, much smaller scale. So the Caterham 21 was the car that the rumours abounded about, and it was announced at the British International Motor Show in October 1994. And on the stand they had a beautiful polished aluminium bodied example hand rolled by none other than Roach Manufacturing down in the New Forest, who still exist. And there are plenty of brilliant companies in the UK. I'm really delighted to say that can make you a fabulous hand rolled aluminium body for your car or whatever you want, whichever car. Some brilliant ones as well, including Shapecraft. It's one of my favourites, but Roach Manufacturing are arguably right up there as well. And Keith Roach himself did the body for the 21, and indeed it's goodness know what is it, some 30, nearly 40 years. No, sorry, 30 years. Maths has never been the clever point. 30 years since he did that car or that body, and Roach still show it off on their website. So if you visit that, you'll see it there. Questions were asked about the name. Why was it called the Caterham 21? Why wasn't it the Caterham 8 or the Caterham 9? Purely because in 1994, that marked 21 years since Caterham acquired or took over the 7 project. So that's kind of as complicated as it gets. Really, it wasn't. It was just simply marking a time in a date in time. 21 was a totally clean sheet design, and development started in January 1994 with Jez Coates, then Caterham's technical guru. Jez is one of the names, shall we say, inverted commas, of Caterham cars over the years. A very skilled engineer, and they set to in a barn at Jez's home in Essex. Assisted by his trusty right-hand man, a lovely bloke called Reg Price, who sadly is no longer with us. Now, Reg, I don't think, and in fact I know, does not get the credit that he deserves in the annals of Caterham's history. A school teacher originally from just over the valley from Caterham on the Hill in Merstham. He was a school teacher there, but he'd pop in to see Caterham cars up on the Hill in Townend during school holidays, and he and Graham Nairn got on very well. Graham offered him a job. I could see the talent that he had and the enthusiasm he had for the 7. Reg resisted initially, but he did go full time at Caterham Cars. Initially working with Jez's predecessor, Clive Roberts, who went on to bigger and arguably greater things. He went to work for Lotus, worked on the development of the M100 Lotus At. Before that was when Lotus were owned by General Motors, and then he was posted to or transferred to Detroit, and he worked on some cars for GM in Motor City, no less. And then when Jez came on board, ex-Leyland Trucks, to take over from Clive. I think they overlapped actually to a certain extent, a little bit. But when Clive moved on, Reg assisted Jez. So the two of them went off to in private, a bit of privacy in Jez's barn, to develop the chassis and the underpinnings for the 21. I've read somewhere that the development cost totaled £130,000. Remarkable, really. Equivalent, allowing for inflation, to about £175,000 GBP today, which I think is actually pocket money, unbelievably, when you compare it to other projects that have appeared in recent years. Indeed, Jez told Johnny Tipler in his book Lotus and Caterham 7's Racer for the Road that it was like a boy's dream come true for him. Boy's own dream come true, by the way. Sorry. And he was very excited when Graham told him about the new idea. And he told me, I spoke to him in 2021, and he told me that during that process, obviously they were full on with the 21, but they still couldn't neglect the 7 because there was always new developments for that to take care of. The styling. Now, it's assumed, I think, by some people that Jez did the styling. He didn't. It was done by a chap called Ian Robertson, who trained as an industrial designer on a 3-year course. I think he was at the Royal College of Art. Very versatile chap. because he initially worked at Caterham Cars in the marketing team. And then when in the early 90s, when he was he pitched for the 21 design and got it, he was working for Haymarket Publishing as deputy news editor on Autocar magazine. Very, very skilled chap, actually. The brief called for him to produce 4 designs, which he did, but both he and the rest of the team, which including Graham Nern, David Wakefield, Jez, and Andy Noble, settled on the first one that he did. As far as they were concerned, it couldn't be bettered. So that's the one they proceeded with, full scale. I don't know if it's clay or foam, but they kind of worked up a model and worked from there. The idea behind it, I think, was for it to be a more practical version of the 7. I think Graham wanted to use the standard 7 space frame, but they couldn't do that because Jez said the body would have just been too low for the 21, so they had to use an amended version of it. But the underpinnings of it were pretty similar, and you could see the outline. And indeed, I think there was probably a bit simplistic, but the primary addition was outriggers to allow for the full body of the 21, which also had doors. First Caterham to have doors, of course, as well as give a little bit of rigidity for the side impact. Created a bit of a wide sill area, which you had to step over to get in. Some people didn't like that, but most just got on with it, and I didn't really find it too much of a hardship. It did mean that ladies wearing skirts could sometimes find it slightly undignified getting in and getting out of the car. And of course, it didn't have. We might as well talk about that now. It didn't have, shall we say, someone said proper windows the other day, which did actually, I reckon, hinder it a little bit. And also because the chassis between the two cars were different, with the 7's front narrower track than the rear, although the 21 was parallel front to back. And Jez said that allowed for extra width at shoulder level, which is important in a car with doors and with a full body. Did, however, feature the same double wishbone front suspension, had a wider anti-roll bar. Vauxhall Calibra rather than standard fare Caterham 7, that they chose a Vauxhall Calibra steering column, as it had, Jez said, and it's quite obvious really that why he would want that, better quality stalks. Caterham doesn't necessarily have stalks, indicator stalks and stuff, but they, so we say, sports cars of that type definitely needed them, and he reckoned that the Calibra had the ones that they wanted. Also, the first Caterham to have an adjustable steering wheel, fore and aft. As I said, the first one had, or the first show car had an aluminium body, and it was done really for dramatic effect. It was decided that although the production versions would have 11-piece, I think, GRP body, glass fibre body, that show car would feature a full aluminium body in delicate 16-gauge aluminium. We mentioned Keith Roach did the beautiful work on it. Prior to its launch, Jez anticipated, although he wasn't sure at that time, that the 21 would be available in both turnkey and kit form. Although kit form wasn't written in stone until further down the line, really, because there was initial resistance at Caterham in the hierarchy there to offering it in kit form. But Jez's argument was that as long as they could give kit builders the right quality of parts and components, there shouldn't be a problem. I think they were worried about people maybe not putting together cars of the quality that they really wanted them to be, but they overcame that. Excuse me. The kit version was known as the Clubman, and I'm jumping ahead here, but on launch that cost £18,750, which was a very, very comprehensive kit actually. And not much cheaper actually than the anticipated fully built GRP example would cost, which I think was projected to be £19,000. So they were, I think it might have been when the time come to press the pin and actually offer it for sale, I think that price had risen. I'll scan through the notes as I talk and probably be able to answer that one. They did actually were prepared to offer customers an aluminium body if they wanted one. That was an extra £20,000 added to the cost of the car, and that would be an 18, which is slightly more robust than 16. Sitting here in early 2025, reading this, £39,000 seemed like a bargain for a Caterham 21 with aluminium body, to be honest with you. I did miss out the part where I mentioned the outriggers taking care of the side impact, or helping the side impact issue, was honeycomb stroke glass fibre box sections, which reinforced that sill area around the outriggers. This was then bolted to the chassis, thus helping with extra rigidity for side impact, or possible side impact. They also added substantial diagonal engine braces from the centre of the front bulkhead to just 4 of each, or just behind each suspension unit. I've just now stumbled on my notes and found that the launch price fully built examples were £19,495, so they weren't too far from his projected £19,000 claim or estimate. Entry level car had a 1.6 litre Rover K series producing 115 bhp. They also then offered a super sport version with a K series 1.8 VVC engine, delivering probably about 140 horsepower, maybe 145. That was more expensive at 22,995. Although the extra outlay for that, in addition to slightly more power, brought with it a full leather interior, a 6-speed, not a sequential, but a 6-speed H-gate, and a limited slip diff. There was a later edition of a very high performance derivative, which I drove. I drove all of them actually. But that VHPD one was pretty spectacular, really. Even though it was 100 kilos heavier than a comparable 7 with the same engine. I think the car only weighed about, well, sub 700 kilos, so it was hardly lardy. So it went very well indeed. Excellent engine, the VHPD. Styling, I think I look at it sometimes and I still think it's box fresh. I think there was a nod to the Lotus 11 in the styling, which wouldn't surprise me. As I mentioned earlier, those didn't have wind-up windows, which came in for a bit of criticism. But it was a rigid structure, it really was. And the extra 100 kilos arguably gave it a more, well, I wouldn't say sophisticated, but a more compliant quality of ride. Their aim was to sell 200, or they could handle capacity of 221s per year. And given that it was designed by Jez, or developed by Jez Coates, it was a stylish looking car and based around the all-conquering 7. What could go wrong? So why did they only sell 49 of them until it was quietly withdrawn in 1999? I think many lay the blame squarely at the door of the Lotus Elise Series 1, designed by Richard Rackham and Julian Thompson, although it was the brainchild of then Lotus owner Roman Artioli, who named it after wanted it named after his granddaughter Elisa. Their brief, called for a basic step-in sports car, and that first broke cover at the Frankfurt show in 1995, in the year after the Caterham appeared. I think also the Caterham took something like 26 months to appear following that first show appearance, where it went down really well, and I believe that some orders for it, or potential orders, would have been diverted to the Elise, really. The first 21s didn't go on sale until spring 1997. The delay, I've heard said that it was due to the time taken to create a suitable interior for the 21. Again, I'm not sure if that's true or not. I remember reading a feature in Philby's Witch Kit magazine in the May 1997 issue where they bemoaned those 2 lost years it had taken for the car to go on sale. And they described it though as a 7 for grown-ups, which I'd agree with really. And it appeared on the front cover. They did plunder the mainstream car parts bins for the 21. Rear light lenses came from, I love playing a guessing game for rear light lenses, that actually came from the Ford Mondeo Mark 1. Rover 200 stroke Metro donated its door mirrors, the Mark II Vauxhall Astra its door handles. Even the Suzuki Cappuccino piped up with its front indicators. Although we mentioned the steering column from the Vauxhall Calibra. Meanwhile, that distinctive curved windscreen was bespoke, and it was produced for Caterham cars by Triplex. Why didn't it do better? Andy Noble, who now runs Sevens and Classics and Fulham in Kent, which is literally the back garden of Brands Hatch Circuit. I could quote him really as saying it was almost a very good car, but not quite. He believes the lack of winding windows and being a tad too small inside, and maybe a lack of practicality compared to its rivals. He points at those as sort of reasons, really. It certainly wasn't too expensive, that's for sure. But surely, my argument is it surely deserved better despite those compromises, especially when you note that its main rival, S1 Elise, I think, sold over 10,000 units, which is serious numbers. Other rivals included MGF and Renault Sport Spider, I think, but it was mainly the Elise that could be said to have done the damage to the sales for the 21. I still don't think it's the disaster that some have claimed. I don't think that at all. Far from it. Let's face it, if they'd have pushed the racing series, which they attempted to do slightly later on, they could have maybe done what Ginetta, pre-Lawrence Tomlinson, Martin Pfaff era, Ginetta did with the excellent G20 race series. If that had carried on, if they could have done something with that, that would have worked beautifully, I think. It would have generated a lot of sales. I was actually looking at a 21 a few days before this piece. And even 26 years at the time of writing in 2025, there's no doubt that time has been kind to it. There are some areas of real beauty on it. I mean, look at the lovely aluminium door hinges. The boot release catch is a beautiful thing. Plus the internal bonnet moulding and things like that were clearly given lots of thought. A Mark II was actually prepared. It was a radical departure. I've never seen a photo, a rendering of it even. And was intended to use a lot of MGF parts for its architecture, including the subframes. And as a result, that would allow them to fit larger engines. Ultimately, I don't think there was any desire within Caterham cars to launch that and pursue that idea, and it was again gently canned. There was actually a Caterham 21 GTO. That was prompted, I think, by the success of a Belgian race team called GPS Racing, who'd fitted a 21 with a hardtop, and I think they raced in the Belcar race series, and they literally cleaned that series up. Did very well, and that success didn't go unnoticed at Caterham's technical department at the Dartford factory at Kennet Road. Other people had ventured on track with them, I think, as well, but there was no works. There was no works entry of any sort. I don't think there's any race series for it to competing in the UK, but I may be wrong with that. But Jez was certainly encouraged to create what was called the G21 GTO. It's a more hardcore version. I've seen it written that it was the 21's slightly unhinged brother. Did have more power. It used some interesting facts about that. It used the same engine that the Caterham 7 R500, Superlight R500, was fitted with. That bonkers 230 bhp, 1.8 litre Minister Power built K-Series, X-Power K-Series, which was a brilliant thing. Body shell was actually fitted with an integral hardtop, and the whole kit caboodle underwent extensive wind tunnel work and testing at Myra.
So the nose was revised, the rear, as were the rear and the sill sections were also changed. And it also had a carbon fibre rear wing option. It didn't look a bit like the Belgian racer, but it was totally unrelated. Under the skin, the standard 21 suspension was heavily revised. It had completely new geometry and pickup points, while springs were said to be 10% stiffer. And Jez worked with development engineer Charles Hayhurst on the 21 GTO, which had a starting price at just £5 under £40,000. And that was launched at the NEC Motor Show in October 1999. Some conjecture about how many were made, but I think there was definitely two, because I've seen evidence of an orange one and a silver one. But however, if that was true, I'm not entirely sure. I mentioned Reg Price earlier on, and then I switched, promptly forgot to develop that idea, really. Reg was a lovely old character, didn't really probably like publicity, a diligent, determined worker. Lots of upgrades on the Caterham 7 over the years were due to him, really. His tenacity and desire to improve the car. He was a very, very popular member of staff, could speak his mind and probably rub a few people up the wrong way, but people loved him for that. He didn't suffer fools gladly at all. Wasn't coining a cliche, but it's true. And very handy driver. He didn't start racing until he was 40 years of age, bless him, but he did pretty well. And I think he doesn't get enough mentions in dispatches in Caterham's history as he deserves. So here's a little tribute to Reg Price. But anyway, that's the Caterham 21 roundup in a concise form. I hope you'll agree.
Well, thank you for watching. If you've got this far, I hope you've enjoyed it. Why not give us a thumbs up and click on the bell and the all option. And if you want to be really fantastic, why not check out some of the videos that are up here for you to have a look at. Anyway, we will see you next time. And like I said, please subscribe. It really does help the channel. And do share the link with friends. And hopefully you've got something useful and helpful and interesting out of this video.
We want information.
All right.
Information. Information.
All right. See you next time.